We interrupt this broadcast with truly devastating news. Officials have confirmed that the incident at the Capitol is far worse.
Peace.
Chicago police are still searching for a group of men accused of shooting 4 people near LaSalle and Hubbard.
It started at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, Southside Chicago. The intersection of South Halsted and 63rd Street was not quiet that night. It never is. But what happened there in the span of 4 minutes was not a gang dispute, not a drive-by born from street politics, not anything the media would correctly categorize in the 12 hours that followed. 19 people died, 11 on the sidewalk, 3 inside a late-night diner, 4 in 2 separate vehicles that were caught in the crossfire, and 1 woman, Assistant State's Prosecutor Elena Vargas, who had parked her car 2 blocks from the Daily Center Annex and was walking toward a pre-dawn emergency arraignment that she would never reach. She was the target. The other 18 were collateral architecture. A message sent in blood and gunfire to anyone inside the federal system who thought they were getting close. The shooters were gone in under 3 minutes, professional, coordinated, and according to the first federal analysts who reviewed the surveillance footage, moving with military-level discipline, this was not street violence, this was enforcement, cartel enforcement, and it had just made the biggest mistake La Sombra Roja would ever make, because it forced the hand of every federal agency that had been quietly circling the Chicago Port District for the better part of 36 months. By 2:15 a.m., the FBI's Chicago field office had activated its Joint Tactical Operations Center. By 3 a.m., a secure conference line connected the special agent in charge to DEA Regional Command, to ICE Homeland Security Investigations, and to a DHS intelligence director operating out of Washington whose name we are not using tonight for security reasons. The decision was made in that call. No more patience, no more surveillance windows, no more waiting for the next intercepted shipment to build a cleaner case. 19 people were dead. A federal prosecutor was one of them. The operation was going live before sunrise. At 4:19 a.m., the city was still dark. Lake Michigan pushed cold air through the Port District, and the fog that rolled off the water sat low and thick across the freight terminals at the Chicago International Port. The cranes stood motionless. The loading docks were silent except for the low hum of refrigerated containers. If you had been standing at the edge of Pier 7 that morning, you would have heard nothing. And then, in the space of a breath, the nothing became everything. 16 federal strike teams drawn from FBI Chicago, DEA Midwest Division, ICE Homeland Security Investigations, and 3 specialized DHS tactical units hit 31 target locations across the Port District and the South Side simultaneously. Black SUVs moved without headlights. Agents dressed in tactical gear materialized from alleys, from unmarked vans, from positions they had held for the last 2 hours in absolute stillness. Flashbangs detonated in 3 separate port warehouses at the exact same second. Doors came off hinges. Suspects scrambled for exits they had already prepared and found agents waiting at every one. In Warehouse 14C, a structure officially registered as a cold storage facility for agricultural imports, agents found something that no manifest had ever declared. Beneath 48 pallets of freeze-dried produce packed in authentic shipping containers stamped with legitimate Chilean agricultural export codes, they found a subterranean access hatch, reinforced steel, hydraulically sealed, connected to a chamber 40 feet below the port floor. Inside that chamber were $17 million in vacuum-sealed currency bundles, 312 kilograms of near-pure cocaine, approximately 2.1 million fentanyl pills stamped with counterfeit pharmaceutical markings, and a methamphetamine processing station that had clearly been operational within the last 48 hours. The smell alone, agents later said, was enough to make your eyes water from the doorway. The DEA forensic unit estimated that the fentanyl pills alone, at street distribution level, had a retail value capable of supply chaining into every major city from Chicago to Pittsburgh without a single law enforcement detection event under the current routing system. But the drugs were not what stopped the lead FBI tactical commander in her tracks. What stopped her was in the back corner of the chamber behind a steel shelving unit that had been welded to the floor. A server rack. Operational. Running. Encrypted, but running. And next to it, a sealed Pelican case containing 17 separate hard drives labeled not by number but by city. Detroit, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Kansas City, Minneapolis, Cleveland, Columbus, Louisville, Des Moines, Memphis, Omaha, Cincinnati, Gary, Rockford, Springfield, and one labeled simply Chicago Coordinate. She looked at those drives for a long moment. Then she got on the radio and said 4 words that changed the scope of everything that followed. She said, "This is the hub. 12 hours later, inside the FBI's Cyber Forensics Division operating out of a secured annex on West Roosevelt Road, the analysts who cracked the first layer of encryption on those drives found themselves staring at something that no one in the room had fully anticipated, despite 36 months of groundwork and 3 separate grand jury proceedings. What they found was a complete operational architecture, not fragments, not partial records, everything. La Sombra Roja, the Red Shadow Cartel, had not merely infiltrated the Chicago Port District. They had engineered it, rebuilt it from the inside. The network diagram that emerged when the analysts pulled the relational data from Chicago Cord was so complex, and so layered, so structurally precise, that one senior analyst, a 17-year veteran of federal digital forensics, sat back in her chair and said quietly that this was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. This was not negligence. This was engineered treason. They called the internal operation file Project Iron Fog because everything that followed moved through the fog of legitimacy, through the legal structures, the official titles, the government budgets, and the authentic paperwork that made it invisible. And at the center of Iron Fog, with his digital authorization key embedded in the logistics routing of every single narcotics convoy that had passed through the Chicago port in the last 3 years, was a man named Director Aldous Crane, Port Authority Director of the Chicago International Port District. The career administrator, appointed 6 years ago, universally described by colleagues as a competent, if unremarkable, bureaucrat who wore the same gray suits and ate lunch at the same deli every day and never, in anyone's memory, drew any attention to himself whatsoever. That invisibility, the analyst would later confirm, was not an accident. It was his most important professional qualification. Crane's digital signature was on everything. Shell companies registered in Delaware with no physical addresses and boards of directors composed entirely of deceased individuals. Ghost logistics firms with federal port access credentials that had never been audited because Crane himself had restructured the audit schedule 3 years ago, citing budget constraints. Your sham charitable foundations funneling grant money through agricultural processing fronts into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, in the Isle of Man, in a trio of shell banking entities registered in Montenegro that had been dissolved and re-registered 11 times in 4 years. The money moved like smoke through ventilation systems built specifically to disperse it before any single regulatory body could accumulate enough to see the full picture. But Iron Fog saw all of it, and when the analysts traced the final thread from the offshore accounts back through a reverse-engineered series of wire transfers, they landed on a cartel logistics account that DEA had flagged 2 years earlier in connection with the Sinaloa-linked distribution network. La Sombra Roja was not affiliated with the Sinaloa cartel or the CJNG cartel in this operation, but it had learned from both of them. It had taken the financial sophistication of one and the infrastructure brutality of the other and fused them into something new. Something that had turned the Chicago Port District into its permanent North American command center. Crane had not just left the door open. He had built the door, installed the hinges, and handed over the key. The next phase began at 5:44 a.m., while it was still dark over the city. Inside the Joint Tactical Operations Center, a digital map of the greater Chicago metropolitan area and the surrounding 4-state corridor covered the primary display wall. Dozens of red markers pulsed across the screen. Each one a confirmed Iron Fog target location cross-referenced against the hard drive data, the financial records, the encrypted communications logs, and 3 years of DEA and ICE field surveillance. There were 47 primary targets and 19 secondary targets. They were spread across Chicago's South Side, the Port District, suburban Cook County, Lake County in Indiana, Kenosha and Racine in Wisconsin, and as far south as Joliet. The operation commander, a DHS special agent in charge whose identity remains protected, stood in front of that map for a long moment before he turned to the assembled senior team and said simply, "All units, all targets, execute simultaneously." Over 1,100 federal agents moved at once. FBI, DEA, ICE, SWAT teams from 4 separate federal jurisdictions, DHS tactical units, 2 U.S. Your Army National Guard logistics and containment units operating under federal emergency authority. 3 Black Hawk helicopters provided aerial coordination over the Port District and the South Side Highway corridors. A joint Coast Guard and DHS maritime unit locked down lake access to the port. Every exit route, every freight lane, every service tunnel, every adjacent rail spur had a federal presence. There was no gap. For the first time in 3 years, the Iron Fog network had nowhere to breathe. In a converted auto body warehouse in Bridgeport that cartel ledgers identified as Dispatch Node 7, agents found a drug super lab, operational, mid-cycle, 3,000 square feet of fentanyl synthesis equipment, a methamphetamine finishing station, and 218 kilograms of cocaine awaiting packaging for regional distribution. The workers fled through a rear exit and ran directly into a DEA containment perimeter. In a lakefront mansion in a northern suburb, registered to a Delaware LLC, with no traceable human ownership, agents breached 4 floors of security to find encrypted communication servers, 17 illegal firearms, 4 cartel logistics coordinators, and a safe room containing $42 million in currency that had been prepared for international transfer within the next 72 hours. In a residential block on the far south side, ICE agents and federal human trafficking investigators broke through the door of a transit house where 11 migrant individuals were discovered in conditions that federal agents described in their after-action reports as a humanitarian emergency. They had been held as leverage, as human collateral in a smuggling arrangement that La Sombra Roja had been running as a secondary revenue and operational security stream, using the movement of people through the same corridors that moved narcotics, because the human element confused detection algorithms and distributed the evidentiary load across multiple agencies that did not share real-time data under standard protocols. A tunnel was found. It was not the dramatic border region tunnels you may have seen in news reports about operations in the Southwest. This one was different. It ran from a legitimate port access substructure beneath Pier 11 to a commercial district 2 miles inland, terminating inside the basement of a dry cleaning chain that had operated without apparent disruption for 4 years. The tunnel was 41 inches wide, fully lined, electrically lit, and equipped with a rail system for moving cargo. It had been used, according to the Iron Fog logistics data, to move an estimated 12 to 14 tons of narcotics per quarter for the last 2.5 years. Every time a standard port inspection was scheduled, a maintenance flag had been entered into the port operations system by someone with administrative access. By Aldous Crane. The inspectors had been legally, procedurally, systematically redirected away from the freight zones that mattered. Not once. Where in 9 separate scheduled inspections had a single federal or state inspector set foot in the zones that concealed the network's primary infrastructure. They found Crane at 7:12 a.m. He was not at the port. He was not at a secondary location. He was at his home, a modest single-family house in a middle-class neighborhood in northwest Chicago that bore no sign of the $42 million found in the lakefront safe room, no indication of the $19 million laundered through the Cayman shell accounts, no external evidence of any kind that this was the man who had redesigned a federal port facility to serve as the central nervous system of a cartel drug empire. He opened the door when agents knocked. He was dressed. He had made coffee. Agents who were present have described his expression not as fear, not as defiance, but as something closer to resignation, as though he had always known this morning was coming and had simply been waiting to find out which morning it would be. He said nothing. He was handcuffed, walked to a federal vehicle, and driven away while his neighbors were still asleep. What the investigators found in his home was the final piece. An encrypted personal device registered to a name that did not exist contained a communication archive stretching back 4 years. In it were direct encrypted messages between Crane and a La Sombra Roja logistics director, operating out of a location that DEA is not publicly identifying. The messages confirmed everything Iron Fog had built its case around and added details that even the hard drives had not contained. Crane had not merely provided access. He had actively briefed La Sombra Roja on federal enforcement timelines. He had transmitted internal DHS and Coast Guard inspection schedules. He had sent advance warning of at least 3 DEA interdiction operations in the greater Chicago corridor, operations that had come up empty in ways that had frustrated agents at the time, and that now, reading the message logs, made complete and devastating sense. He had been operating as a cartel intelligence asset embedded inside a federal infrastructure framework. This was not a rogue official skimming benefits from criminal proximity. This was a handler, a logistics architect, a man who had turned his government appointment into a full-spectrum operational service contract for a cartel that was poisoning the American Midwest one fentanyl pill at a time. When investigators pulled the patrol records and internal correspondence from the Chicago area law enforcement units that had overlapping jurisdiction with the Port District, what they found reinforced every worst-case assessment the task force had quietly held for months. 14 local officers across 2 departments had received payments traceable through Iron Fog's financial layer. Their patrol grids had been modified on specific dates that corresponded, almost without exception, to La Sombra Roja convoy movement windows. 3 officers had submitted falsified after-action reports on nights when migrant smuggling transports had moved through their assigned zones. 2 had actively interfered with a state police stop in 2023 that, had it proceeded, would have intercepted a vehicle carrying nearly 60 kilograms of fentanyl. One deputy chief in a South Suburban department had been on Cartel payroll for an estimated 2.5 years and had used his administrative access to flag a DEA surveillance asset as a department informant risk, resulting in the asset's reassignment and the loss of 6 months of embedded intelligence gathering. These were not outliers in a broken system. These were components of a parallel system, a second invisible enforcement apparatus that operated inside the legitimate one, serving a different master, protecting a different enterprise. An honest detective, a 15-year veteran who had worked organized crime cases his entire career, sat in an interview room with federal investigators and said nothing for almost 2 minutes after being shown the list of names. Then he said he had trusted some of those men. He said it quietly. He did not say anything else. The full reach of the Iron Fog network, once the hard drive data from all 17 city-labeled drives was processed, was not a Chicago story. It had never been only a Chicago story. The port was the hub, but the spokes ran in every direction. Trucking contractors registered through Iron Fog's Delaware Shell network were moving La Sombra Roja product on federal highway corridors across 8 states. Way station records showed maintenance closures at 4 separate stations that corresponded precisely to heavy load convoy schedules logged in the cartel's internal routing system. A fake green energy grant program, routed through a sham nonprofit with a name that evoked Midwestern agricultural sustainability, had been used to establish legitimate commercial premises in Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Detroit that served as regional distribution waypoints. The network was moving an estimated 15 to 18 tons of narcotics per month through this corridor system. Cocaine from South American production sources arriving through the port, repackaged and distributed. Methamphetamine synthesized domestically at Chicago and secondary lab locations. Fentanyl, the engine of this entire operation, arriving in bulk chemical precursor form through deliberately mislabeled container shipments routed through the port's agricultural import channel, a channel that Aldous Crane had specifically worked to exempt from enhanced DHS chemical detection protocols 18 months ago, citing cost efficiency restructuring. The final file on the Chicago cord drive was labeled simply Phase 3. Federal analysts who reviewed it described it afterward as the document that changed the way they thought about the scale of what La Sombra Roja had been building. Phase 3 was not a logistics plan. It was a political infrastructure blueprint. It outlined a strategy for expanding cartel influence into state-level procurement contracting, into judicial appointment advisory networks, into campaign financing structures through layered PC contributions that would be legally undetectable under existing disclosure frameworks. It described a 10-year horizon in which the Chicago Port District's cartel architecture would be so deeply embedded in the operational fabric of regional governance that no single federal prosecution or enforcement action could excise it without triggering institutional collapse in the agencies and offices that had been allowed to grow dependent on the financial and operational resources the network provided. This was not a cartel that had infiltrated a system. This was a cartel that had been in the process of redesigning the system for its own permanent future. The badge was not just for sale. The entire institution had been scheduled for renovation. By the time the morning shift at the port arrived for work at 8 a.m., they found federal vehicles at every gate and agents with credentials they did not recognize, directing them to a staging area where federal investigators were waiting to take statements. The cranes did not move that morning. No freight containers were processed. No manifests were filed. The Port of Chicago, one of the busiest inland cargo ports in North America, was silent, and in that silence, you could feel, if you were standing there, the weight of what had just happened. The weight of years, the weight of 19 bodies on a South Side street, the weight of a prosecutor who had died walking to work because she had gotten too close to the truth. And the weight of 11 million fentanyl doses moving through a legitimate port authority on a railroad installed by a man in a gray suit who ate lunch at the same deli every day and made sure no one ever looked at him twice. Here's what this story is really about. Because the raids are not the story, the arrests are not the story, the tunnels and the hard drives and the shell companies are not the story. The story is what happens between the lines of the official record in the neighborhoods where the product landed, in the families who lost someone to fentanyl and never knew their grief had a logistics coordinator. The story is what systemic corruption does to the fabric of democratic governance. Slowly, quietly, so deliberately that by the time it is visible, it has already become load-bearing. Power does not always need open violence. Yarkin, sometimes it only needs silence and the right appointment at the right port authority at the right moment in time. La Sombra Roja understood that. Aldous Crane understood that, and for 3 years, that understanding cost this city in ways that no seizure number, no matter how large, can fully express. The fentanyl that moved through Pier 11 did not stay in the port. It went into apartments and high school bathrooms and car parks and rest stops from Chicago to Cleveland. The cocaine that moved through cold storage 14C went into communities that were already bleeding from 100 other directions. The methamphetamine synthesized in Bridgeport went into lives that became statistics in county health department reports that no one reads carefully enough. These are not abstractions. These are the real numbers. The ones that do not fit on a press conference placard. Federal prosecutors are expected to file charges against Director Aldous Crane and 43 additional defendants across 6 jurisdictions. The full scope of Iron Fog remains under active investigation. The La Sombra Roja cartel's North American logistics network has sustained, according to federal sources, the most significant operational disruption in its history. But as every veteran of federal organized crime enforcement will tell you, disruption is not destruction. Networks rebuild. New directors get appointed. New tunnels get dug. The only thing that changes the math permanently is an informed public that refuses to let the silence continue. If you're still watching, tap like right now so more people see this story. The algorithm buries what it cannot sell. Arsatechesti, you are the only reason the truth travels further than the feed. Comment the word expose below if you believe political infiltration by organized crime is a story that deserves to be in the center of every conversation happening in this country right now. Share this with someone who thinks cartel operations are only a border issue, because what happened at the Chicago port was not a border story. It was a governance story, a democracy story, and it is far